our next presenter is Ms. Judy Williams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you to excuse me because I am in fact down with a cold and I was trying very, very hard this morning to see whether I could pull myself from the bed to come here this afternoon. Let me join with my brother, Kenrick Radix, to welcome all of you to Grenada and to hope indeed that you will contribute something to the economy and make it possible for our public servants to get paid this month. Let me also say that I cannot stand in for Sister Decima Williams, who should have been here. I am simply not worthy to untie the straps of her sandals. So I cannot stand in at all for her. What I will try to do, however, is to share with you some of the experiences I have had and the people with whom I work had, particularly as women, during the 4.5 years of our revolution. Let me also say that I do not consider myself an intellectual at all. I am in development work. That is where I have been for most, if not all of my life. And at this stage, I am, as I have been for the last 15 or so years, involved in rural development. So I am not talking and I am not going to share with you in a theoretical way, but in a very practical way, what the experiences of people, of rural people, of the masses of this country was when on March 13th, on Tuesday, March 13th, 1979, an announcement came that said, the dictator Gary has been overthrown. A revolutionary government is in power. Everybody should come out and support to make sure that this revolution triumphs. What did that mean for somebody like myself in a rural community, working with rural people, very scared, very unsure about what the next day will bring, because at the time, as Kenrick have already so eloquently put it, we were under the dictator Gary, and none of us really knew when, where, and how we are going to spend the next day. For us in the community in which I lived, which I still now do live, it meant beginning to organize in a different way. Beginning to look for the people who were supportive, the people who were there to do what the revolution said would be done. Because hours after this first announcement came, the voice, which I only recognized much, much later, said that the revolution was for food, for housing, for education, and for health care. At that time, the voice left out what, to my mind, turned out to be the most important thing that the revolution meant. And that is, the voice did not say that it meant people's participation. However, that aspect of the revolution is what I think is going to live on, and which is what is going to not allow the people of Grenada to take and to accept what so many other people in this part of the Caribbean is accepting. Because during the 4.5 years, we as a people knew what it meant to participate. We knew what it meant to come together, to share our ideas, to give our ideas, to discuss our business, as we say in this country, to discuss the things that mattered and the things that would influence our lives. And therefore, from March 13, 1979, people of this country organize around the leadership in a way that they didn't and they couldn't prior to the dawn of March 13th. As women, we organized in several ways. I remember on the Thursday after the Tuesday, I was able to get a vehicle borrowed from somebody in the community because I didn't have one. The organization I worked for wasn't able to afford one at that time. And I had enough food to put in that vehicle, fruits and vegetables and cooked food, to take to the radio station where most of the people and the leadership was concentrated at the time. And that was not because I had asked anybody to donate food. It was simply because people in the community, for whatever reason, I do not know. I am sorry they are not here, and I think we have to create an opportunity to get the people of this country to talk about that experience, because we have not done that as yet. And I dare say that the revolution and what the revolution meant, and I'm using it in the present because it still means a whole lot to us. What this period means to us will never, ever be successfully understood until we as Grenadians get an opportunity to come together to sit and to discuss it, to discuss the strengths, to discuss the weaknesses, to discuss the challenges, and to discuss where we go from here. That opportunity have not yet been created, and we must create it. We are beginning to work on something, but we would need the support of all of you who are here. We would need the support of all our friends who are not here to be able to put that together and make it happen. And for whatever reason, people felt that Judy is someone who is definitely supporting this process, and therefore I am sure we can count on her. People just came and they brought food, and they say, take it to the comrades. And I was able to drive that vehicle into the radio station loaded with fruits and vegetables and cooked food. And when I got there, something happened which is a living memory for me, and it's one of the most gratifying things that have happened in my life. Because prior to that, I had spent almost 10 years working in an institution that is owned by the Roman Catholic Church and trying to train and to develop young people from the rural communities who would have dropped out of secondary school, left primary school, had very little to do, had very little to hope for. I had tried to work with them over the years to give them some reason for being. And I remember I would say to people, there must be a better way. We cannot be the way we are forever. There must be something different and something better. Let us work together until that day comes. I did not know that when I arrived at that radio station, I would have seen more than 50 of the persons I saw there as people who had passed through that center and who were celebrating because they felt that that day had in fact come. And that is what I witnessed on that day. As we went on during the process, we found that as rural people, we were not mama guy, as we say in Grenada. We were not fooled. We were asked genuinely by the people, by the leaders, by the technocrats, by the people who are in the planning units, the people who are in education, the people who are in community development. We were consulted and we were asked for our views. And it was not because they were using us as some little token, but because they genuinely felt that we had a contribution to make and that our contribution mattered. And to my mind, as I said, that for me was the most important thing that the revolution gave to Grenadians. The power to participate, the opportunity to take themselves seriously and to make an input into what would happen in their own lives. And so we found people were coming together. Something, sisters and brothers, that I would love to see happen again in this country. And something that needs to happen in this country. As Kenrick have already mentioned, the unity that we had during that 4.5 years, I never saw it before. I can only hope that I would have long life enough to see it again, because it is certainly not here. People were coming together to discuss the problems they had, to discuss how they can sort out these problems, to discuss what kind of little contribution they can make that would add up to changing and to dealing with basic issues. So it was not uncommon to find a group of women in a rural community sitting down and discussing the problems of child abuse, child neglect, the question of children not going to school, the reason why the schools are looking so dilapidated. What can we do about it? How can we as parents get into the school and repair the chairs and the broken benches and tables? It was not uncommon to find that. It was not uncommon to find people sitting down in the community and discussing the fact that the roads are in a dilapidated state, and it's our roads, and if they have to get any better, we have to go out there and do it. It was not uncommon to find that. And it is because people were able to do that, that to my mind, we were able to do a number of things in this country that today we cannot do. And I have never seen so much money circulated in this country as I saw in 1984 and 1985. However, today, we are a bankrupt nation. And I'm serious when I say I hope you spend some money so that the public servants can get paid. I'm very serious. It is not a joke. The economy of this country today is bankrupt. I was in a session on Monday evening when we were talking about structural adjustment and its effects on people in this region and in this country. And a government technocrat from the macro planning unit had to stand up before the crowd of about 150 Grenadians and admit that the last time the Grenada budget balanced was in 1982. And people shouted from the crowd, what made it balance then, why it can't balance now? And to my mind, it balanced then because in spite of the many enemies that the revolution had, in spite of the many things that people said the revolution was about, that it was not about, people in this country pooled their resources together, limited as they were, and they made things happen. And we did that because we felt it was our process. We were proud to be Grenadians. We were proud to be counted. We were proud to say where we were from, because we felt that that process belonged to us. As women, in particular, we were able to shake off the terror and the fear that we had under Garyism. We knew the very few prostitutes that we had in this country. And every time I have to think about that, it's a very emotional piece of trauma for me. Because I remember an experience when one afternoon I'm into St. George's, dashing as I very often have to do from one piece of activity to another. And I ran into Jacqueline Creff, and she said, stop, stop, stop. Where are you going? This is what? I am on a mission. There are 4 prostitutes here in St. George's, and we have to get rid of them. 4. Today, sisters and brothers, we have more than 44. We have more than 44, not because our women want to prostitute, But I dare say because some of our women do not believe that they have much of a choice if they do not prostitute. The 4 women we identified then gave the reasons why they were prostituting. And in that very afternoon, we were able to round up books for their children because they wanted the children to go to school and they had no books for them. We were able to get clothes for the children, and we were able to get homes to put 2 of the boys in so that the mothers could be a little more comfortable. And Jackie was able to get work for the women, decent work, work that had dignity, so they didn't have to sell their body in order to get money. Today, that is not the situation. Today, it is very different in our country, and I feel very much ashamed to talk about some of the things that is happening in this country in order for people, particularly for women, to be able to live. As women also, our cultural and spiritual worth meant something more than just being a housewife, just being somebody who cook and clean and take care of the children. We had an agenda. We had activities that if we did not participate in, could not be completed overall. As women, we knew that there were times and places that we had to be, and there were duties that we had to perform. Not least among them, we knew that we had to participate in the militia and in the army, because we knew that we also had a responsibility to defend our country. I must say that the revolution did not deal with the gender issues, not in the 4.5 years. So yes, we still had a lot of unanswered questions. We still had a number of issues that were not going to get touched when we talk about the man-woman relationship. I am not blaming the revolution in the sense that I think that the 4.5 years was just not enough. The time was not sufficient to arrive at those. However, I must say though that women did get the opportunity to challenge, and therefore the questions were, why should you as the man be the one going to the meeting every night and I have to stay with the children? Why couldn't we share it? Why shouldn't you go 2 nights a week and I get a chance to go 2 nights a week? Were some of the questions and some of the challenges that we raised. Those issues were not fully dealt with, but they were touched upon, and our women were very conscious that these were issues that have to be dealt with. We enjoyed during the 4.5 years the kind of democracy that we never enjoyed before. Because quite frankly, I think what you have now is a sham. I mean, we don't have any democracy in this country today. We have a sham. We have what somebody says from Westminster or from where else is the democracy. Because we go out twice since the collapse of the revolution and we have cast an X around somebody's name and they got in or they didn't get in, and we have governments in power. But that's all. Only last night on a calling program on the radio, I was hearing people asking, how come this country has taken a decision to bring a structural program before the IMF? And how come none of us in this country know about it? How come? And I can tell you that in every other aspect of life in this country today. How come it is in today's Grenada, when we are under a democratic government, how come it is the book sellers that is determining what the textbook is going to be for the next school year? in this country. And that is a reality. How come? How come it is the British government division that is deciding where money must be spent on community development in this country today? We are living under democracy. We have a democratic government in power. That is the reality. During the 4.5 years of our revolution, we did not vote to put the government there. However, we knew those things were happening. We knew what the United States was saying about us. We knew the demand they were making on our government. We knew where we were getting money from to build the international airport and who was supporting the efforts we were making. We knew how many scholarships were being offered by the Cuban and other governments and how many of our young people were taking up those scholarships and going to study. And we knew what they were studying too. And if they were fooling us, we'd have also known that, we knew that too, and we'd have also known it better today. Because as Kenrick has already said, the hospital is stocked with the doctors that were trained during the 4.5 years of the revolution. The Ministry of Health is stocked with the dentists that were trained during that period as well. The Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Community Development, and I can go on. And had it not been for those 4.5 years, we were going to be in a much worse state than we are in today. Today, the kind of thing that we have that we call democracy, I can tell you, in my humble opinion, it's a sham. And people of this country are not involved in it. Let me also say that there are a number of organizations, non-governmental organizations, that participated during that process, and we are the better off for it. Because during the 4.5 years of the revolution, the people like myself who have never worked with a government and never belonged to a political party, was able to find meaning in the sense of what the government was doing was the agenda that the non-governmental organizations were also trying to fulfill. And therefore, it was not difficult for us to be able to work hand in hand with the government. Because you see, the goals and aspirations of the government is in fact what the goals and aspirations of non-governmental organizations, like the one I work with, are. So for example, when we are talking about creating employment for rural people as a non-governmental organization, the 4.5 years of the revolution was also saying the same thing. And not only were they saying it, but they were doing it. So it was under the PRG, during the period of the revolution, that the first ever agro-processing plant was opened in this country. It was the first time farmers knew that they could not only produce raw material that would be exported to an industrialized country and come back here in a can. The industrialized country setting the price for the raw material and also setting the price for the finished product. But farmers knew that they could produce, and some of what they produce would also right here be processed and put into can, and they can have it and they can also sell it to other people. And we had that experience. Today, as a non-governmental organization, we are trying to do that, and it is extremely difficult. Extremely difficult, because in the 1992 budget, for example, the government has just said that they're not going to give exemption, tax exemption, to people who are producing for local consumption. That is written into the budget. They are going to give exemption for people who are producing for export, not for local consumption. So what you produce, you must sell it away if you want government support. That is the reality. during the 4.5 years of the revolution, the PRG said, produce more, because what you produce will be processed here and you'll be able to get it back to eat and to send some overseas. When the revolution said it was about food, the revolution meant that, and we experienced that as people, as rural people. We had a slogan, that's several slogans, and one of them said, grow what you eat and eat what you grow. Today, sisters and brothers, is the opposite. And people are able to make those comparisons. Because today in Grenada, 91% of the protein that we consume in this country comes from the extra-regional market. 91% of our protein food does not even come from CARICOM. It comes from extra-regional markets. That is the reality. When the revolution said it was for housing, it meant that. Because what happened the first time in the history of this country, the government of this country developed a low-cost housing program. And that meant that people who were in the lowest income brackets could not only get money borrowed for their houses, but they could get material so that they can repair their houses and their homes. Today we are hearing that this government was trying, and the government before that, to continue that program, but they're having several difficulties. And as such, they have, every 6 months, they would start it, and after 6 weeks, they will have to discontinue it. The housing program cannot continue as it was during the period of the revolution. That is something that people are talking. And when the people of this country speak about what the revolution meant to them, they don't speak from ideological positions. They don't speak from what Marx says or what Lenin says. They don't speak about what the good book say or what the good book didn't say. They speak about the things that they experience. Food, housing, education. We have a dilemma in this country up to now. Why? Because a number of the people that are doctors in our hospitals today and dentists are not the kind of people prior to the revolution that was able to become doctors. So when you go into a rural community and you ask, who is the parish doctor? The people are well able to call her by her first name for you, or to call him by his first name. And they are able to tell you, Margati's son, you know.
That's right.
And that is the reality. Prior to the revolution, sisters and brothers, in this country, it was only certain types of family and certain kinds of names that could have become doctors and dentists. And those people came out very much from the upper classes in this country. The doctors that we are referring to today in the hospital are not people from upper class families. It's Margate's son. And his Auntie Winnie grandson, that's the dentist. I don't remember the little boy name now, but that little one who used to go to the Anglican school, he is now the dentist. The revolution meant food, it meant housing, it meant education, it meant health care. In this country today, there are several people who are not able to have surgery done on them, women in particular. And I told you when I started, I am not speaking here from book that I read something. I am speaking of women who I encounter day to day because of the work that I am doing and I am involved in. They cannot have surgery to remove some simple lumps or simple, ordinary things that could be done, because they do not have the $500 to pay the doctor. It is no longer free. A teacher friend of mine shared with me the other day that she went to the hospital to get a blood test. And whereas before, you went and you would have had to get your test. They would give you a note so that when you return to get your result, you would bring the fee. Today, you have to pay before you get the test. And she happened to go in and didn't have enough money on her. She couldn't have the test. That is the kind of situation we have today. That is the kind of situation we did not have during the revolution. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, the most important thing I think the revolution gave us was an opportunity to really understand and participate in what the life of this country meant. So I want to end here, and I want to say to you that I think you as intellectuals, and mostly people who have come from outside, would be in a very good position to assist us as we prepare to bring people of this country next year, when we will be marking the 10th year of the invasion of this country and the downfall of the revolution. I hope that people like Sister Decima Williams and Brother James Millett, who are here and who I know have taken already some of the work overseas, will get your support. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judy Williams. Excuse me. Our next presenter is Dr. Terry MARRYSHOW.
Thank you very much, Brother Millett. And like my colleagues before me, let me join in welcoming you all here to this historic 17th Annual Conference of the Caribbean Studies Association. Your presence here today reminds me very much of the kind of intellectual experience that we used to have during the revolutionary period. But ironically, today, we are meeting to discuss not the 13th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution, but the Grenada Revolution in retrospect. At the same time, however, I believe that such a discussion is timely. I would personally like to congratulate the Caribbean Studies Association for bringing this conference to Grenada so that we can have some reflections on the Grenada Revolution. I myself, I do not boast any formal political education, because as you know, my training is in medicine. I am, however, the political leader of the Maurice Bishop Patriotic Movement, a position that I assumed on the 29th of May, 1988. I've taken the liberty to prepare a short paper which I have entitled The Relevance of the Grenada Revolution to Contemporary Politics in Grenada and the Caribbean, and which really reflect my own intimate thoughts on the Grenada Revolution. Much has been said about the Grenada Revolution of 1979 to 1983, since its demise on October the 19th, 1983. Various scholars and writers have analyzed the Grenada process and have come up with varying conclusions, some favorable, others unfavorable. In Grenadian society today, every major newspaper and its editors try to paint a negative image of the revolutionary process. And in 1990, then acting Prime Minister Ben Jones called the general elections on March the 13th, precisely the day that the revolution triumphed, saying that it represented the darkest period in our history, which we must try to forget. Such comments or statements will be inevitable, and many people will see a particular process in whatever way they may wish to see it. However, it is the express purpose of this paper and my presentation to highlight from an objective point of view as I possibly can the positive features of the Grenada Revolution and its relevance to contemporary politics in Grenada and the Caribbean. From the very outset, the revolution triumphed under the most extraordinary of circumstances. at a time when the Grenadian masses had reached their limit with Gary's excesses, his dictatorial attitude, corruption, as well as the general socioeconomic decline of the country. Even though for entirely different reasons, just as it is true to say that the Grenadians welcomed the invasion, the intervention, or the rescue mission, call it whatever you may, by the Americans in October of 1983, it is also true to say that Grenadians welcomed the overthrow of the Gary regime on March 13, 1979. It is not by chance that the revolution was hailed at home and abroad as the peaceful revolution, because when one considers the chaos and mayhem that could have ensued when this unprecedented type of action was taken for the first time in the English-speaking Caribbean, the loss of less than 5 lives in the early period of the revolution is the clearest expression of the support of the Grenadian people for the action that had been taken. It is important to clarify, however, that this paper is not seeking to promote or perpetuate the practice of violent overthrow of governments, but simply to state that in the conditions under which the Grenada Revolution came about, virtually no other alternative was available at the time except to continue to endure a situation that had become grossly intolerable for the Grenadian people. Our experience in Grenada at the time was an extreme that required extremely radical measures to resolve. It is not unlikely that somewhere in the Caribbean in the future, that such conditions will present themselves again, and present-day Haiti may be a typical example of what I am referring to. With the suspension of the Constitution, the People's Revolutionary Government, led by Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel Movement, began to implement almost immediately the structures necessary for introducing a new type of democracy based on true and genuine people's power, a radical departure from the Westminster style of democracy. It was long felt by the leadership of the NJM that parliamentary democracy as it was practiced in Grenada had become a farce and a tool to legitimize Gary's excesses and mismanagement of the country, and they were determined to reverse this trend. With the introduction and establishment of mass organizations of women, youth, workers, and farmers, as well as embryonic village, parish, and zonal councils, the NJM sought to give full expression and involvement of the ordinary working man and woman in controlling his own destiny. It was the first genuine attempt anywhere in the English-speaking Caribbean to put power in the hands of the people. The results of that particular experience in only 4 years was astounding, and had it been given the chance to reach its maximum potential, the politics of the Caribbean might have been irreversibly changed. Because if nothing else, our brief experiment clearly demonstrated that in the absence of parliamentary democracy, it was still possible to bring about meaningful development after years of backwardness. Additionally, the involvement of people in matters which before seemed mundane to them is a means of ensuring the respect and support of the people in the developmental process. The attempts by external forces to pressure the revolutionary government to hold general elections, which were not deemed as an urgent priority at the time, was nothing more than a sinister effort to force Grenada back into the Westminster democratic mold. To have allowed the experiment in participatory democracy to be successful would have spelled the end of the Westminster model in Grenada and possibly other islands of the Caribbean. It must also be remembered that in 1983, the revolutionary government established a Constitution Commission which would have prepared a new constitution reflecting the new political reality of Grenada, one which would have included the holding of free and fair elections and which would have been subjected to intense scrutiny and discussion by the people before it would have been approved. This intention never came to fruition because of the untimely demise of the revolution in that same year. But the involvement of the people in refining and adopting a constitution to guide their social, political, economic, and moral development remains as relevant as ever. If we are to survive politically in the region, our political institutions and thinking have to undergo serious modifications to make them more suitable to the existing needs of the people. With the departure from traditional politics and the establishment of mass organizations, the PRG began to put into place the necessary structures to put the economy in the hands of the people, with the objective of making the economy more self-reliant. The establishment of 2 state-owned banks, the creation of a national insurance scheme, the development of an agro-industrial complex, the undertaking of an ambitious agricultural diversification project with the help of the World Bank, the setting up of the Marketing and National Importing Board, the construction of a new international airport to link Grenada with the rest of the world, as well as the training of hundreds of professionals through local and overseas scholarships, were all measures adopted by the PRG that gave people an overwhelming sense of pride and confidence in the revolutionary process and growing optimism in the future. The full extent of the impact of these measures can never and will never be fully appreciated. Suffice it to say, however, that contemporary Grenadian society still depend and rely on these measures much more than present politicians in office would care to admit. In these times of so-called structural adjustment, it will be well worth the while to carefully examine and even adopt more of the economic policies of the PRG, which for all intents and purposes stressed the importance of self-reliance. From the point of view of the external and foreign relations, the PRG took the bold and calculated step of breaking away from the geopolitical orbit of the West and through a policy of non-alignment began to develop relations with other countries hitherto forbidden or unheard of, even at the expense of incurring the wrath of the United States, who did not approve of some of these relations. However, again, the PRG proved that it was possible to develop and to undertake projects as large as an international airport without receiving a single cent of aid from any superpower, be it the United States or the Soviet Union. Again, for the purpose of clarification, this paper does not seek to promote the severing of relations with any country, but simply to point out the mutually beneficial advantage of having the broadest and most diverse relationships with countries of the world, irrespective of their political systems, based on the concepts of peace, cooperation, and development. This is what the Grenadian Revolution set out to achieve, and today more than ever, it still remains relevant. If Maurice Bishop were alive, he would have been 48 years tomorrow, the 29th of May. This outstanding Grenadian and Caribbean martyr and statesman stands out as a symbol of freedom and liberation for all our people. While fighting for national unity and development, he never lost sight of the goal of Caribbean integration, which was evidenced by his efforts to bring Windward Islands together in the famous St. George's Declaration in 1980. 10 years later, we are just again beginning to realize that ultimately Caribbean integration has to be the answer for the survival of the entire Caribbean, divided along linguistic barriers into English, Spanish, Dutch, and French speaking. As we recount the virtues of Bishop and yearn for his dynamic and outstanding leadership, we should nevertheless be cognizant of the rich legacy of struggle, pride, and dignity that he has left with us. As we remember his famous closing words at the end of every speech, "Forward ever, backward never," we are confident that this legacy will forever live on. But as we remember Maurice Bishop, we also remember that he himself was consumed by the revolution, when counter-revolution led by Bernard Cord and his clique rose up in the bowels of the New Jewel movement and destroyed the revolutionary process. The lessons of that tragic period are indeed relevant to all Caribbean people, and a sobering analysis must take place among progressives to ensure that such a situation is never repeated. There is absolutely no doubt that during the revolutionary process that many mistakes were made, many of which in retrospect could have been avoided if the Cord clique were not so arrogant and drunk on ideology. In the process of building the revolution, the political priorities became distorted and misplaced, and the masses of people who should have been the center and object of development were discarded and relegated to mere lip service, while the party, democratic centralism, and ideological orientation became paramount among the considerations. Probably the biggest mistake of all was the fact that Code and his clique failed to recognize our own political and historical reality, and therefore felt that they could impose their will on the people and get away with it. The surprise turned out to be their own, because they were immediately and totally rejected by the people. Finally, it is my serious and humble contention that the United States invasion of Grenada was totally unwarranted, despite the fact that Grenadians welcomed the presence of the Americans to get rid of Code and his clique. There is even more justification for my contention when one examines the situation in Haiti, where the situation is even more critical, but where the same United States, which champions the cause of democracy, has opted to use diplomatic and economic alternatives rather than military to bring about the required change. It is my firm belief that such alternatives, if applied in the Grenada situation in 1983, would also have brought about the required result, rather than to subject Grenadians to the bombs of the United States. Caribbean leaders who supported the military invasion of Grenada may have helped to establish a very dangerous precedent in the Caribbean, and that particular experience touches at the heart of the struggle for self-determination and the protection of sovereignty. In conclusion, on a balance sheet, the Grenada Revolution of 1979 to 1983, despite its errors and unfortunate demise, brought more positive than negative results to the Grenadian people in the short time that it lasted. In fact, its legacy is what continues to help Grenada to survive even today. Many of the current problems that Grenada society is confronting today has to do precisely with the failure of successive governments since 1983 to continue with the more positive aspects of the revolution. And when we speak of structural adjustment and are asking people to make greater and greater sacrifices, we need only to reflect on the example of the Grenada Revolution that, among other things, was the epitome of structural adjustment. Because it taught us to be inventive, it taught us to be united, it taught us to be pragmatic, it taught us to honor and respect our history, to live within our means, to produce more, to work harder, to study harder, to do voluntary work, and to strive to become more self-reliant as a nation, and to make the sacrifices particularly in the interests of the younger generations. These are the ideas that will always be relevant no matter what era we live in and no matter what country we come from. And if we are going to be serious about development in the Caribbean, if we wish to overcome the syndrome of poverty and underdevelopment and servitude, then these are some of the things that we need to think about. Thank you very much.
At this juncture, we are going to ask Dr. James Millette to please bring this to closure in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you. Dr. Millette.
Thank you. You've been very generous, Mr. Chairman. I expected long ago to hear you structurally adjust this program and require of me to speak for even fewer minutes than you've given me, but I think I will be brief. First of all, I want to begin by associating myself with the earlier speakers on all that they have said to emphasize the importance of the discussion which we are having here today in a regional and I might say also in a global context. First of all, in a regional context, it is clear that the Grenada Revolution was an episode in the development of the nationalist movement in the Caribbean, by which I mean the upsurge of the Caribbean peoples in populist form, beginning with the 1930s and coming on to our own time, when nationalism shared its original elitist character and became populist. And not only was Grenada's revolution the latest episode in the development of that movement, it was also the most radical. And it was unique as well in that it signified the deepest attempt by the nationalist movement in the English-speaking Caribbean to bring the people of the Caribbean into the processes of change which were taking place. And I think that what the speakers have said have all drawn attention to this, particularly in respect of the achievements of the revolution, in respect of the legacy that it left behind, in respect of the inspirations that it has given not only to Grenadians but to West Indians in other places, and in respect of what it portends for the future. Clearly, the Grenada Revolution was also a response to the deformation of the nationalist movement in Grenada in the Gary period. I often think of Grenada as unique in another sense, in that I think it provided an outstanding example of a politician who became neo-colonialist before his time. By this I mean that Gary was a neo-colonialist even before the country became independent, which is not always understood. In the logic of development, a country is colonial, it then becomes independent, and then if it is unfortunate, as most independent countries since the Second World War have been, it lapses into neo-colonialism. But even before Grenada became independent, Gary showed his hand so clearly that people knew he was a neo-colonialist. And one of the unique aspects of the struggle for nationalism in Grenada was that the progressive forces in 1974 were the forces that opposed independence, whereas the reactionary forces wanted it, because Gary wanted independence to empower his dictatorship. And I think that students of political science would find a very rich field of examination in investigating the structures which I think to some extent also help to explain the unique character of the Grenadian achievement and the successful processes which developed here, which did not develop in other parts of the Caribbean. I also believe that the Grenada Revolution rewards study in a way which I think many of us have not really recognized. Since the Grenada Revolution has taken place, a lot else has happened. The socialist community worldwide has been substantially weakened. And many people, in fact, fail to see a link between what happened in Grenada and what happened in that wider socialist society. I think that if we were to take, for example, the simple chronological facts of what happened, it is clear that the destruction of the revolution in Grenada took place before the destruction of socialism abroad.